Avnish, thanks very much for joining me today. Avnish Nanda is a principal of Nanda Law, which is a boutique law firm in Edmonton. And we're here to talk about the Hammurabi Code, but maybe, Avnish, you could start with just talking a bit about how do you describe your law practice and who do you fight for justice for?
Others seem to describe my practice as like a bit of a unicorn law firm or unicorn legal practice, where I do a lot of work that is primarily on behalf of marginalized and vulnerable groups in Alberta and British Columbia. And the focus is on more often not suing kind of the government or large institutional interests that may be privately held, who are engaged in conflict with folks without means. I also do a lot of just general litigation, but most of my practice is lawsuits against the police, lawsuits against governments, prisons, and just, things like that, where there's a big power imbalance and there are challenging, interesting legal questions that have to be addressed.
Right. And you started from a human rights interest, is that right? And that was what kind of drew you into law in the first place? Or?
Yeah, a lot of, I come from like an activism background, primarily around the health and kind of sociocultural impacts of large-scale oil and gas development in northern Alberta on communities downstream from that, so in the Fort Chipewyan area. And those questions, there's like unsatisfying answers to serious social questions, kind of prompted me or encouraged me to go to law school to figure out if there's no political arena or formal political solution to this, when communities are being impacted in this way, maybe there's legal solutions.
Yeah. So we're taking a question from Michael Sorkin's essay, 250 Things an Architect Should Know. And the question is the relevant parts of the Hammurabi Code of Law. And this is a code of law that was written 1700 BC, so almost 4 centuries ago. And it was carved onto a single stone monument and rediscovered, I think in 1901, it was discovered it was kind of hidden for a while. There are like 282 laws kind of written in Sumerian cuneiform code or writing form, which is one of the earliest forms of writing. What do you make of this code? I think, is there anything that stands out to you from this code if we were to look at it from today's perspective?
Yeah, just someone who's so immersed in law, like I've come to realize that laws are a reflection of societies and their values. So when I look at this, I get a kind of a clear sense of what this society, this community valued in terms of distinctions in society between the citizens who are always free, freed men or freed slaves, slaves, and also women or was it sisters or daughters or kind of wives of God? I think that's the term. So you get a sense of how the society was structured. You get a sense that this was probably a merchant-based society because there's so much emphasis on trade, on construction, on shipbuilding, on trading goods. There's more of emphasis on that, I find, than kind of farming or agricultural, though there is a lot of reference to agricultural work. So this probably was a very sophisticated commercial society. There's some like death is often a consequence for any kind of breach of this code. So
yeah, it's quite harsh.
Very harsh. But I also noticed that there's some communal aspects where in instances where, for instance, if someone is robbed or there's some theft of property and they can't find who's responsible, then the expectation is the community is going to get together and make that individual whole who's had stuff kind of taken from them. And you had mentioned about if someone is too lazy to take care of a particular agricultural land, that it falls on the community to kind of step in and get compensated make use of the land for agricultural purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So that stuff is kind of interesting. That's not in our kind of legal system here, but I think it is kind of valuable or interesting. It shows a kind of communal approach to things.
Yeah, that is interesting. And then there's some codes like if a builder completes a house, there's a particular value per surface area that he gets paid. So there's kind of a standardization. If we were to think about a standard wage, for instance, or a standard income, I'm wondering, do you feel like it goes in that direction in some ways, or?
Yeah, it absolutely does. So I do a lot of construction law too, like builders liens, things of that nature. So when I look at that, I note that they prescribe specific compensation, which is not the case here today. We emphasize more kind of contractual law, what the parties directly agreed to, rather than prescribing in legislation what specifically has to be paid for construction work. There is also this emphasis. I think it's important that in our kind of construction or building law here in Alberta or in Canada or largely North America, that there's like protections for both the builder who kind of undertakes the work, ensuring that they're paid adequately, that there's a recognition that they should get value for what they provide, but also for the person getting something built. So it goes both ways because maybe that's just a reflection of how these relationships proceed, but it's not striking to me, but it's just cool to see how the laws I deal with day to day here, protecting both parties in a transaction like this. I look at it here, and there's similar recognition that both parties have to be protected in these sorts of relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but of course, would it be in the same, if a builder puts to death someone from construction, the outcome might be a little bit different today than it might have been then.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very different. Very, very different.
Yeah.
But there's this I guess recognition of immense responsibility and consequence if a building isn't done properly. I just right now our codes on this, like from the kind of the building code to like various lien legislation, it's like very thick. It's like very thick in Alberta right now. In this code, it's only about eight or 10. Yeah. So it's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. So, I mean, a couple of things that stood out for me and being not studied in law, and it's very layperson questions, but I think the idea of, there's first do no harm that kind of seems to come out. So if some of the laws are set up to protect, the idea is really go in with your practice, if thinking as an architect or as a designer, going in with your practice thinking about first do no harm. That seems to come out as one of the things. I don't know if that's something that strikes you. And then the other is, the eye for the eye that has come out as kind of a strong tenet maybe of law. So I don't know if you can comment on either of those things that come out, or if maybe there's something else.
No, for sure. I think that's an interesting way to phrase it, like a do no harm perspective, that when you're engaging in your trade or your work, come from it from a point of view where, you don't do no harm. But when I look at this, it looks at me, it appears to be this kind of understanding at some point that there will be someone who doesn't do that, that someone will build a house in a way that will cause injury, cause death, and they are prescribing very strict consequences for that because they want to incentivize the builder not to kind of perform shoddy work. And to me, that may be a reflection of what is the nature of human beings that kind of is infused into this code, where there appears to be a recognition that even if someone who is skillful and competent may be lazy, may engage in their trade in a way that could cause harm to others, and in order to prevent that from happening, they need to create an added incentive to do things correctly, construct buildings correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And that is often ensuring that that person can continue to live. So
Right.
I think, you know, there is a reflection of, or at least an insight into human nature, at least according to this society or this culture, this community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And then I think one of the things that I'm curious about, maybe as the last question, is Sorkin mentions the relevant sections of the Code of Hammurabi. And I guess I'm going to just throw out the question of how do we define relevance? And I think, you know, you've been advocating for a province where we all belong. You've been dealing with a lot of justice in areas of social equity. So I guess I'm going to ask, can we separate social and ethical codes from building codes, or must everything be weighed together? Like, where do we put the building in relation to the rest of the social and equitable codes?
I think it all has to be mixed in together, particularly when you come to like laws and regulations and codes, because again, like as I said at the outset, this is all a reflection of certain values, certain kind of norms, understandings of human nature, what a society ought to aspire to be, and values. And when I look at, in that sense, you know, you cannot just take out building codes away from what we as a society value in terms of, particularly in terms of, you know, social stratification, equity issues, inclusivity issues. And I think if people think that they can approach, you know, in this case, architects or builders, their trade in a way that's devoid or not considerate, doesn't consider these broader issues, and what kind of legal norms and societal norms are infusing the laws that they're following, I think, you know, it does a disservice to maybe what that principle of do no harm, or just what kind of society, what kind of community we want to build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting. I don't think this is in any way suggesting that architects must understand legal code, but I think it's more the principles behind the understandings that we're all supposed to be aware of to some extent. And this is how society exists in an equitable way, in an equitable fashion.
Yeah, and I think that there are going to be some architects, at least I know, like hopefully myself as a lawyer, where, you know, I'm subject to a certain code as well. I'm subject to following a certain types of law when I'm helping clients of mine, but just the nature of who I help and how I help people, and just kind of what kind of community I want, I will, like, you know, obviously comply with what the law is, but approach it in a manner where I think is more equitable. So like on some level, this is like bare minimum, but in order to kind of ensure that your conception of the good in society or what society ought to aspire for is kind of imbued in your work, you go beyond. So you kind of more critical and yeah, and aware of how your actions are either kind of contributing to your notion of what a just and fair society is relative to what isn't.
Yeah. So there's almost a code of ethics that rises above the legal code is the base, and then the ethical code kind of sits above that a little bit.
Absolutely, for me at least.
Yeah, that's great. Avnish Nanda, thank you so much.